It's saying that this dude is all about business. He don't want no sides. You know what I mean? He don't need nothing extra. All he wants is to go out there and chop meat, take care of business.
Yeah, Booker T really did name the 10 wrestlers he couldn't stand. And when you see who made this list and why, you are going to look at one of wrestling's most respected figures in a completely different light. Booker T.O. Huffman Jr., known to the world as Booker T, 5-time WCW champion, WWE champion, King of the Ring, Hall of Famer, a man who grew up in the Booker T. Washington projects in Houston, Texas, who served time in prison as a teenager for aggravated robbery, and who came out the other side of all of that and fought his way to the absolute top of professional wrestling through more than 3 decades of relentless hard work. That story is not a television script. Every part of it is real, and the respect he receives from performers, promoters, and fans across every era of this business is not courtesy. It is earned. Well, now that is what makes the question so interesting. If this man is so respected, so admired, so widely regarded as one of the most professional figures in the history of this industry, why does he have a real enemies list? Not scripted rivalries for television, not promotional heat for a pay-per-view build, real, genuine, documented animosity with 10 different performers that stretches across more than 30 years and multiple companies and dozens of incidents. Some of these men Booker has confronted directly and physically. Some of them he has criticized by name on his podcast over and over again for years. Some of them represent specific moments in his career where real friction boiled over in ways that affected real people. And some of them represent something even bigger than any individual conflict. They represent a philosophy, a very specific idea of what this business is supposed to be, who deserves to be in it, what the standards are, and who gets to enforce them. Before we get into it, hit the hype button on this video right now if you are already locked in. It tells us you want more content like this, and it genuinely helps the channel reach more people. We appreciate every one of you who shows up for stories like this one. Now let us get into it properly, because here is the truth you have to understand before any of the names on this list make sense. Booker T does not just love professional wrestling. Booker T has appointed himself one of its keepers. He operates as a standard bearer who believes the integrity of this business depends on performers holding themselves to a certain code. And when they fall short of that code, he does not stay quiet. He says something. He does something. Sometimes he says it on a podcast. Sometimes he says it with his fists. He will tell you that is professionalism. He will tell you that is protecting the business. And in some cases, he is right about that. But when you listen carefully to all 10 of these conflicts, when you add them up and look at the pattern they create, a different picture starts to take shape alongside the one Booker wants you to see. Booker T is a gatekeeper, and gatekeepers always believe that their gate is the right one. They decide who meets the standard. They get to call it enforcement when they apply the code, and unprofessional when someone else does the same thing. They are always on the correct side of the line they draw because they are the ones drawing it. That does not make everything he says wrong. Some of the people on this list genuinely cause problems. Some of them were dangerous or dishonest or unprepared for the responsibilities they were handed. In those cases, Booker's criticism has real merit and real weight behind it. But in other cases, the judgment looks more like ego protection than business protection. More like a personal score being settled than a standard being upheld. And understanding that difference is what makes this list genuinely interesting and genuinely complicated. Let's count them down from 10 to 1. Number 10, Swerve Strickland. If you want to understand how Booker T relates to the current generation of professional wrestling, this is your clearest example. Swerve Strickland is one of the most compelling performers working in wrestling today. He built his profile through AEW and became a major name through a combination of genuine in-ring excellence and a sharp understanding of how to build a character and a brand in the modern era of wrestling. He is explosive, creative, and knows exactly how to generate the kind of moments that travel far beyond any single broadcast. And Booker T responded to him like a superior officer addressing someone who had spoken out of turn. The conflict began when Swerve made comments questioning Booker's role in the current wrestling landscape. He suggested that Booker's criticisms of younger talent were less about wisdom and more about a veteran's desire to maintain relevance and authority. Booker's response was swift and very public. On his Hall of Fame podcast, He told younger performers in no uncertain terms to stay in their lane. He questioned Swerve's attitude. He questioned whether someone at that stage of their career had earned the right to critique a Hall of Famer. Swerve escalated. In Philadelphia, in front of a crowd, he delivered a promo that put Booker's name alongside a word that starts with the letter before G in the alphabet. He used the full version of that word. The crowd responded. The moment circulated widely. By the standards of modern wrestling storytelling, that is effective heel work. That is a performer making himself bigger by taking on a legend and daring the legend to respond. Booker T did not see it that way at all. He viewed it as genuine personal disrespect, not smart professional character work, just a young man who failed to understand what it means to acknowledge the history of the people who built what he is now benefiting from. And that is where the real ideological divide lives. Swerve's view is that respect flows from what you are doing right now, not from what someone did decades before you arrived. Booker's view is that respect for veterans is a non-negotiable foundation of this business, regardless of what era you are working in. Those two positions are never going to find a middle ground. When Booker calls it disrespect and Swerve calls it business, they are each just defending the version of the industry that shaped them. And in the process, Booker becomes exactly the kind of figure he has spent years criticizing. Someone who uses their position to silence people rather than listen to them. Number 9, Sammy Guevara. From one AEW name to another, and to a conflict that follows a similar pattern but lands on different ground. Sammy Guevara is a legitimately gifted performer. His athleticism is the kind that makes people stop what they are doing and pay attention. He connects with crowds in a natural way. He has range and personality and has been one of the more consistently watchable performers in AEW across his career. He has also been involved in multiple real, physical altercations with colleagues backstage. Not staged, not for television. Real confrontations in real locker room environments. The most notable ones involved Eddie Kingston and Andrade El Idolo, and both situations created genuine turbulence within AEW. Booker T went public with his criticism. He said Guevara was demonstrating a clear lack of professionalism. However, he argued that a performer who gets into real fights with colleagues repeatedly is a dangerous presence in any locker room because the entire business depends on physical trust between performers. When that trust is disrupted by a pattern of real violence backstage, everyone around that performer suffers. That argument is not entirely without foundation. Wrestling requires genuine trust between performers every single night. Volatility in the locker room creates anxiety that can affect performance and safety. Booker's concern about what backstage fighting does to a working environment is legitimate in principle, but then you have to consider the fact that Booker T was involved in one of the most famous backstage fights in WWE history. That story is coming up on this list, and when Booker tells it, he does not tell it as a cautionary tale about losing control. He tells it as a story about enforcing respect, about standing up for standards, about doing what needed to be done. The exact same category of action is leadership when Booker does it, and a lack of professionalism when Sammy Guevara does it. That asymmetry is the consistent feature of how Booker T applies his standards to the world around him. It is a feature, not a flaw, in his worldview, and that is worth paying attention to. Number 8, Jeff Jarrett. Let's move back from the modern era and go to the period when some of the earliest foundations of Booker T's professional grievances were being laid. Jeff Jarrett was a constant presence in WCW during the time when Booker was establishing himself as one of the company's top performers. Jarrett was frequently positioned as Booker's main event opponent, which meant a lot of matches and a lot of championship situations that Booker felt did not serve the product well. The core complaint is about how the championship was treated. In WCW during this period, title changes happened frequently, and sometimes without the kind of long-term storytelling that would have made each one feel meaningful. Booker T has always cared deeply about championship prestige. The belt, in his worldview, is the validation of everything a performer has earned through years of sacrifice. Every time it changed hands in a casual or rushed way, it took something away from that meaning. Jarrett was often at the center of those moments, and the resentment built over time. Then came TNA, and the dynamic shifted in a way that created a different and more complex layer of friction. Because in TNA, Jeff Jarrett was not just a performer, he was the founder. He had creative control, he made booking decisions, and he also competed in the ring as a main event performer. He held the NWA World Heavyweight Championship multiple times in the early years of the company, often in situations where the case could be made that other acts were better positioned to be the face of the promotion in that moment. For Booker T, who arrived in TNA with real international credentials and an established reputation, working within that dynamic was genuinely difficult. You cannot negotiate your creative direction fairly when the person controlling the bookings is also the person competing against you for the spotlight. And that is a real conflict of interest. And Booker has made clear that he had significant friction friction over the direction of the product and how creative decisions were being made. The note of irony that hangs over this entry is that one of Booker T's consistent positions is that power should not be used to protect the person who holds it. He resents when influence is weaponized for personal gain. He finds it deeply frustrating when the person at the top of the card is also the person deciding who gets to be at the top of the card. He just does not always hold himself to the same examination when the shoe is on the other foot. Number 7. Santino Marella. This entry is different from everything else on this list, and the difference matters. Booker T does not appear to have a personal problem with Carmine Corelli, after the man who played Santino Marella. The issue is the character, the gimmick, the entire comedic construct and what it represented during the period when Booker was at one of the most character-invested phases of his career. King Booker was one of the most deeply committed character runs Booker T ever undertook. He wore full royal robes. He spoke in an aristocratic accent. He carried himself with regal dignity in every context. His wife Charmel served as his queen, and they presented themselves as literal royalty wherever they went, and Booker took all of it seriously. Not as a silly television exercise, as a genuine performance that was supposed to make the World Heavyweight Championship feel like the most important object in the wrestling universe. Santino Marella's whole act was built on the opposite principle. He was endearing because he was bad at things that professional wrestlers are supposed to be good at. He stumbled, he fumbled, he made faces of wide-eyed alarm. He had catchphrases that audiences loved because they were joyfully ridiculous. He was one of the most beloved characters on the entire roster during that period, and the crowd connection was genuine and strong. Booker reportedly developed real heat over this because, in his view, a comedy character in or near the championship picture was a direct threat to the prestige of the title. If the belt can be associated with someone who makes the audience laugh at how unserious wrestling can be, what does that do to audience investment in the championship when a serious storyline demands it? In Booker's framework, prestige requires seriousness. Santino Marella was the opposite of serious. And the counter-argument writes itself. Comedy has been fundamental to professional wrestling across every decade of its modern history. The fans who loved Santino were not confused about what wrestling was. They were enjoying a version of it. And his Royal Rumble moment, where he lasted exactly 2 seconds and the crowd went completely insane, is one of the most beloved pieces of television from that entire era. The ability to generate that kind of reaction is a legitimate and difficult skill, but Booker T could not make peace with that. He saw it as a threat to the integrity of everything he believed the championship should represent. And that tells you something about how tightly he holds the one specific version of wrestling that he considers legitimate. Number 6, Jim Cornette. I know Jim Cornette occupies a unique space on this list because he is not a wrestler and never has been. He is a former manager and promoter who has been involved in the wrestling business for decades and who runs a widely followed podcast where he gives opinions on the state of the industry with characteristic volume and conviction. He has strong opinions on virtually everything and delivers them loudly and without much concern for who gets upset. Booker T has been public and consistent about his dislike of Cornette. He has described him as bitter. He has argued that Cornette's approach to the wrestling business is actively harmful to its future. And he has made a point of highlighting Cornette's history of making controversial comments about black performers and Japanese performers, pointing to incidents that were widely condemned and that resulted in Cornette losing a prominent position in a major wrestling organization. On the factual record around those specific comments, Booker's criticism is grounded in reality. The incidents happened. They were documented. They generated significant and deserved backlash. Calling attention to that history is not an unfair move. His broader philosophical objection to Cornette is about what he represents to the industry. Booker's view is that veterans have a responsibility to help wrestling grow. The role of someone who has been in this business for decades is to pass knowledge forward, to support new talent, to contribute constructively to what the industry is becoming. Cornette's approach, in Booker's view, is relentless tearing down, an unwillingness to find value in anything that does not match his version of what wrestling should be, an old man yelling at a world that has moved on without him. The thing worth noticing is that Booker T runs a podcast where he evaluates modern wrestling and the people in it, where he calls out performers he believes are falling short, where he positions himself as a voice of authority on professional standards. The content is different from Cornette's and the underlying values are different, but the behavior, sitting in front of a microphone and publicly judging who is and is not meeting the standard, is a shared habit. Both men believe their version of wrestling is the correct one. Both men are willing to say so at length and at volume. Booker just believes his standard is the right one, which is exactly what every gatekeeper believes. Number 5, Buff Bagwell. Now we enter the territory where these conflicts had real consequences for the direction of the entire wrestling industry. July 2nd, 2001, Monday Night Raw, a night that mattered enormously and failed in every possible way. Here is the full context. The WWE had completed its purchase of WCW, the promotion that had gone to legitimate war with WWE for ratings dominance through the late 1990s. Booker T was the reigning WCW champion when the acquisition happened, which made him the person carrying the flag for everything WCW had built. WWE decided to run a WCW main event on Monday Night Raw as a proof of concept. The idea was consequential. If the crowd responded well to a WCW match on WWE programming, there was a genuine possibility that WCW could continue as a separate brand with its own television presence and its own roster identity. That was the prize. That was what was at stake. The match was Booker T versus Buff Bagwell, and it failed completely. The crowd gave it almost nothing. The energy in the building was flat from the opening bell. There was no heat and no investment. WWE decision makers watched from the back and made their choice quickly after the match concluded. The WCW as standalone brand concept was over. The experiment had lasted exactly one main event. Booker has said in interviews that the match was designed to fail. He makes a credible argument. WWE had real business reasons to ensure that WCW looked like a lesser product. If WCW produced compelling television on WWE programming, it would have complicated the absorption of the brand and the talent. Letting it fail was institutionally cleaner. The match was probably never going to be given a genuine chance, regardless of how either performer performed on the night. But Booker also blamed Bagwell directly and specifically, and the specific details he points to are genuinely damaging. Bagwell complained backstage about not being permitted to wear his signature top hat for the match. On a night that could have changed the trajectory of an entire brand, the concern going into it was whether he could wear his hat. Bagwell's mother, Judy Bagwell, who had appeared on WCW television in her own right, allegedly called WWE management to excuse her adult son from a prior commitment due to illness. Not Buff Bagwell making the call himself, his mother. And around this same period, Bagwell was involved in a physical confrontation with Shane Helms, performing as the Hurricane. Helms ended that altercation by hitting Bagwell with a frozen water bottle. For Booker T, who was supposed to be the WCW champion, demonstrating that WCW could produce something worth watching, sharing this experience with someone this chaotic was a direct insult to what he was trying to accomplish. Number 4, Stone Cold Steve Austin. The rivalry between Booker T and Stone Cold Steve Austin is one of the genuinely entertaining chapters of the early 2000s in WWE. Their December 2001 supermarket brawl is a segment people still replay more than 2 decades after it happened. It is one of those pieces of television that just works. The chemistry between the two, the spontaneity of it, the genuine chaos of two elite performers working off nothing but instinct in an actual grocery store environment, all of it combined into something memorable. And behind all of that entertainment, there was real tension. Booker has been open about the conditions under which the supermarket brawl was made. There was no script. WWE gave them a grocery store and an instruction to entertain the fans. Nothing more specific than that. What followed caused approximately $15,000 in damage to the store. Displays destroyed. Product thrown across aisles. An extended brawl improvised in real time. On one reading, that is impressive creative instinct under zero structure. On another reading, it is 2 professionals causing thousands of dollars in property damage because there was no plan and nobody thought to make one. The moment that reveals the real underlying tension came during a separate match between the two. At some point during their program, Booker hit Austin with a right hand that landed harder than it should have. Too real. Too stiff. Austin, who has based an entire persona on being the toughest man in any environment, did not respond well. He reportedly became genuinely and legitimately angry, not in a performed way, but in the way a person gets angry when they feel disrespected, and he made a real attempt to knock Booker out in the middle of a televised match, not as part of the scripted story, as a real retaliation for being hit too hard. When Booker tells this story, there is something in the framing that sounds like pride, like the fact that the situation escalated to that level is evidence of how genuine and intense the competition was. Like real anger from Steve Austin is a form of validation. But if you step out of that framing and look at what actually happened, 2 professional performers nearly had a real fight in the middle of a scripted performance because one person hit the other too hard. That is not a badge of honor. That is a near incident that required luck and professionalism from both men to not become something far more serious and far more damaging to everyone involved. And the way Booker presents it as a story of authenticity rather than a cautionary tale says something about his relationship with the line between acceptable intensity and recklessness. Number 3, Triple H, WrestleMania 19, March 30th, 2000. 2003, Safeco Field in Seattle, Washington. There are nights in the history of professional wrestling that live in memory not because of what happened, but because of what should have happened and did not. This is one of the most persistent and most discussed examples of that kind of night, and it still causes genuine discomfort for wrestling fans who were watching live and for those who have gone back and watched it since. When the build to this match was one of the most charged and deliberately provocative storyline periods of the era, Triple H's character was constructed around the idea that Booker T did not belong at the highest level of this business. The specific line that has never fully faded from conversation was Triple H looking at Booker and stating that people like him do not get to be champion. The phrase landed with unusual weight. Triple H's defenders argued it was about Booker's criminal past. Critics heard something else underneath it. The audience heard something else. And regardless of what was intended, the emotional impact was real, the heat was genuine, and the story the line set up had one obvious and earned conclusion. Weeks of television pointed toward the same destination. Booker T as the underdog who had beaten impossible odds before. Ike, who had rebuilt himself from a genuinely dark chapter of his life, who had climbed to the top of multiple promotions through years of real sacrifice, finally silencing the loudest and most powerful voice telling him he did not belong. The crowd was absolutely ready to give him that moment. The story demanded it. Triple H won, cleanly, a pedigree and a 3 count, except for what happened in between those 2 moments. After hitting his finishing move, Triple H did not cover Booker. He got up, he turned to the crowd, he extended his arms. He stood over Booker T and soaked in the reaction of the audience while the seconds ticked away. 23 of them. 23 full seconds of Triple H performing supreme confidence and total contempt for any possibility of a comeback while Booker lay unable to respond. And then Triple H walked over and covered him and got the 3 count as if it had never been in question. The message embedded in that sequence is not ambiguous. Waiting 23 seconds and then still pinning, someone does not just say you are the better performer. It says the other person is so far beneath you that you can afford to waste time, to pose, to perform your dominance over them, and still have nothing to worry about. In wrestling terms, that is called a burial, a deliberate and public diminishment of one performer's status to reinforce another performer's position at the top. Triple H during this period was widely understood to be operating with significant backstage political influence that extended beyond his in-ring accomplishments. His relationship with WWE's ownership had given him access to decision-making power that most performers could never dream of. The term used for this period was his reign of terror. WrestleMania 19 was one of the defining moments of that era. Booker T has addressed this match in ways that have frustrated many of his fans. He acknowledges the outcome could have changed his life. He does not deny what was at stake, but he says the bitterness faded when the paycheck arrived. And he has said it more than once. Different people read that differently. Some see healthy pragmatism from a man who accepted what he could not change. Some see a man who was given every reason to challenge institutional power and chose to cash the check instead. And some notice the contrast very clearly. And this is the same Booker T who fought a colleague physically over not shaking hands at a commercial shoot, who threatened legal action over old stories, who has spent years calling out performers on his podcast by name, but WrestleMania 19, he got the check and he moved on. The biggest moment of potential disrespect in his entire career, and that is the one he chose to accept. Number 2, Batista, May 2006. A commercial shoot for the SummerSlam pay-per-view, one of the most famous legitimate fights in WWE history, and a story that tells you exactly how Booker T's version of respect works and what happens when he believes it has been violated. The backstory involves Batista's rise through the WWE ranks. He had become a massive star quickly, both physically and in terms of his audience connection. But the speed of that rise had, honored by multiple accounts, created a sense of inflated importance that was affecting how he carried himself around colleagues. The backstage term is big head. He had developed one. Specific incidents on a recent Australian tour had already created friction. And then at the SummerSlam commercial shoot, Batista arrived and acknowledged only a small group of performers, the top names, Fit Finlay, and then walked past the rest of the roster without a word or a nod. In the culture of professional wrestling, where the expectation is that every single person in the building gets greeted and acknowledged when you arrive, this was a clear and visible violation of the code. Batista had also reportedly made comments suggesting that SmackDown's television ratings had declined in his absence, which did not endear him to the performers who had been there and working the entire time. Booker T decided to handle this personally. The fight that followed lasted several minutes and had 2 separate exchanges. Booker has consistently maintained that he finished the fight, that he stood his ground against someone he considered to be acting like a bully, and that he did not pick the fight but absolutely finished it. The witness accounts complicate that version. Fit Finlay, who observed it directly, correctly and had no obvious reason to spin the story in either direction, noted that Batista ended up on top of Booker, with Booker pinned to the ground when they were finally separated. Booker reportedly had visible swelling around his eye afterward. Kurt Angle described it as a genuinely brutal exchange that left both men clearly beaten up. And Sharmell, Booker's wife, reportedly kicked Batista in the groin during the altercation. Batista, by the accounts of those present, did not react to the kick at all. Years later, the two reconciled, and Booker has genuinely praised Batista's Hollywood success. The story has a civil resolution, but before you reach that resolution, you have to sit with what the story actually is. Booker T got into a sustained physical fight with a colleague that lasted several minutes and left both men injured because that colleague did not shake enough hands at a commercial shoot. He frames this as enforcing locker room standards and protecting a code that the whole business depends on. He is not entirely wrong that the code is real, but if any of the performers earlier on this list had done the exact same thing for the exact same reason, you already know what Booker would say about it on his podcast. He would call it a lack of professionalism. He would call it dangerous and irresponsible behavior. He would frame it as someone who does not understand what it means to carry yourself with the dignity this business requires. And the only variable between their version of it and his is who is doing it. Number 1, Ahmed Johnson. Every other conflict on this list has some degree of complexity. There is always some mutual contribution to the friction, some element where both sides have at least a partial case to make, some context that explains how things got to where they got. This entry is different. This one is not complicated. This one is just deep, enduring, undiluted personal hatred that has not faded by any measurable amount across more than 30 years. And shows absolutely no sign of fading now. Tony Norris. Ahmed Johnson, one of the most physically imposing athletes WWE signed in the mid-1990s. He was pushed aggressively and quickly, winning the Intercontinental Championship in what looked like a significant long-term investment from the company. He had the tools to be a major long-term act, and it collapsed largely because of the reputation he had built for himself in the business. The history between Booker T and Ahmed Johnson goes back before either of them was working on national television. It goes back to the Texas independent wrestling scene, specifically the Global Wrestling Federation, where both men were building their careers in the rawest form of the business. And that is where the roots of this hatred were planted. Deep roots, more than 30 years old. And according to everything Booker has said about it, not loosened by time even slightly. Booker T has called Tony Norris a notorious liar and a piece of trash on his media platforms. Not as a passing comment made once, consistently, repeatedly, with a heat that does not have the quality of old business that someone has processed and put behind them. It sounds fully alive. The specific dispute centers on what happened during the period when Booker T was incarcerated in the late 1990s.